by rude and crude and shallow and animalistic individuals who called today and threatened to kill a child of one of our members and the wife of one of our members, who called today and had a bomb threat in this chamber, who called me and had obscenities on my telephone recorder about my mother. I will not allow it.
After the vote from one ally,
I think that a lot of us are relieved that we now can see that there's a mechanism for funding the budget, making sure that it's stable.
but tax opponents remain firm.
Well, the Democrats got their tax increase, but I think it's the last one they're going to get for a long time. I think this is going to spill over, obviously, into the halls of the Senate now and onto the campaign trail. I think people are deeply angry about this and very frustrated. I know I am.
But I think that the Senate President probably will give his support to this bill, and I think if that happens, unless there's a tremendous public outcry in opposition, that is going to go through the Senate.
George Kevarian is the Speaker of the Massachusetts House. He is a state representative from Everett, and he is a candidate for the Democratic nomination for state treasurer. Mr. Speaker, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Why did the bill pass now and not 4 months ago or 5 months ago?
I think the members kept insisting that we try very hard to cut wherever we could. So if I proposed a tax program or new revenues along with cuts, they preferred that we do the cuts first. We tried very hard to do that. I think we showed we showed and kept faith with the members by cutting over $1.2 billion from the governor's proposal and the budgets that we passed. And as time went on, and it got clearer that there was a $1 billion deficiency for fiscal 90, no matter, and that there was nothing left to cut of a major nature that could eliminate that. The only answer was additional revenues.
People, I think, in general, find it hard to believe out there in this political environment that the legislature has cut as much as can be cut from the budget. The sentiment out there is that there is an enormous amount of waste in the state government. You're saying that's not true.
That is not true. We have cut many, many areas, but people should realize that of a $12 to $13 billion budget, more than $4 billion of that is direct and indirect local aid to cities and towns, and nobody would have us reduce that. And as a matter of fact, much of what we did for new revenues was to guarantee that there'll be local aid in fiscal 90 and 91 for the cities and towns to prevent layoffs of teachers and firefighters and police and the closing of schools. Now, about another third of our budget are human services. Medicaid costs alone are driving this budget forward. In the last 2 years, Medicaid has increased by $600 million in Massachusetts. Half of that state dollars, half federal, 40% of that nursing homes, Charlie. And in the next fiscal year, it would increase by over $700 million in 1 year, not 2. Those are the reasons that the budget is running out of sight. We have to make some major structural changes in this budget, and in the proposed 91 budget, we begin the solution to this problem, the long-range solution, by making major changes in our Medicaid expenditures, and hopefully the members will have the courage to vote for these changes in law that will start the restructuring.
Mr. Speaker, if what you just said is all true, if there has been all of the waste that can be cut out of the budget, and if we are down to the bone pretty much in this, why is it in this political atmosphere that so many people doubt that? Why is it that there is such a widespread belief, apparently, that there is this cronyism and waste that's going on on Beacon Hill?
Because you can always point out, let me revise the statement. Is there more to be cut? That you can always find more to be cut. What I'm saying is there's not $2.3 billion to be cut. The $1 billion fiscal 90 deficiency, the $1.3 billion you would need for fiscal 91. And so we will continue to look for areas that we can reduce the budget. But the length of time that it has taken for us to resolve this problem, Charlie, the fact that talk shows and other media have had an absolute field day in pointing out areas here and there of a campaign worker that was placed on a payroll, a court officer, press secretary. They have convinced everybody that the cronyism and hacks and occupied state government, and that nobody is working on behalf of the people. This is absolutely untrue. You can always point that out in any major kind of organization. But it is not what would characterize the Massachusetts budget fairly.
This was clearly a very emotional issue for you, a very emotional moment. You were, in the piece of tape we just saw, either in tears or certainly on the verge of tears, very upset and troubled by all of this. Why is this so emotional for you?
Well, I think after a lifetime in public service, something that I feel very proud about and always felt very good about my colleagues who are devoting, in my opinion, a great deal of their efforts at very little pay and compensation. And the one thing that we do receive in public life with everything else that we don't is some kind of respect in the community for the work that we try to do. When people malign us as thieves and crooks and give us motives that do not, in fact, correctly reflect what I see, I think it's very painful to me and painful to the members. And then when we start to see the kind of mean-spiritedness where they will make outrageous threats that members cannot dismiss lightly, then I, as the leader of the House and representative of the others, have to speak my mind. And I am kind of a sensitive individual, and sometimes I lose control and when I speak emotionally about things. But that's why it bothers me.
All right, I want to pursue that, and I want to talk a little bit more about the atmosphere in just a minute. We'll be right back with Speaker George Kevarian. Stick with us. Guest is House Speaker George Kevarian. Mr. Speaker, we were talking just a minute ago about the very ugly atmosphere that exists in Massachusetts. I remember not that long ago, 15 years ago maybe, when politics, at least in this state, was considered a very noble kind of calling. There was great respect, even reverence, for a lot of politicians. It was something that you were really looked up to if you were in politics in Massachusetts, either in an elective or appointive office. It has gotten, in the past year or so, unbelievably ugly. You mentioned earlier in the program the telephone calls, people talking, people making death threats, people using obscenities in relation to your late mother. Howie Carr, for example, the columnist, in his columns is regularly making fun of you because of your weight, etc., etc. How has it gotten so ugly? What has caused this?
I don't know. I think people have found a ready audience, and Howie Carr, people enjoy looking for his column and reading it. He says he's an entertainer. I say that he hurts people, and there has to be a recognition that the people that he is regularly maligning are also human beings and have feelings and do not especially enjoy the public laughing at them because of their physical appearance. I think that's rather cruel. I think
does it hurt you when he does that to you?
Yes, it does, yeah. It hurts me personally, and it also hurts me to realize that there are people in this world that will malign others because of things that they cannot control. I do not, all my life, I have protected people, the handicapped, the poor, the blind, the aged, people who are vulnerable citizens. I don't like others kidding them. I like people making fun of them, and I don't think that's humor. I like to think that I'm a very funny and humorous and witty individual, but the one thing I don't do is hurt other people.
Mm. I wonder, when you look back on this whole process for the past few weeks, whether you have any fear that this will be all for naught in the next month or so, that this process will stall or die in the Senate, and that there will be no tax increase.
I have no doubt that there'll be a tax increase. I can't tell you what it will look like, because obviously the Senate is an independent body and will have its contribution, and there'll be a conference committee. But both the Senate and the House are committed to new revenues, and we know that they're necessary. And so I believe that there will be, in the end, a revenue program.
What do you say to the people like Barbara Anderson, who's going to join me on the program a little later on, who talk about this process as having essentially duped the people out there, that people were made fools of in this, and that in fact it's just another effort by the Democrats to ram something down people's throat that they don't want?
There is no benefit to me or any Democrat in raising taxes. We're not foolish enough to think that support of a tax program is what makes us popular, but it is a responsible thing. If you are in power, in control of the government, and you can't just stand back and criticize it, but actually have to make it work. Many people have realized the need for revenues. We're not trying to dupe anybody. I would be much better off, both politically and personally, as would my colleagues, if I were to say no new taxes and bash Governor Dukakis like everyone else does and go up on the popularity polls. The fact that we don't is some kind of, I think, recognition that even in the worst of times, there are people in the legislature who will stand up and do what is responsible despite what comes of that personally, politically, and as an institution.
Do you think Barbara is going too far in her continuous criticism of the House for its tax increase?
Well, you know, Barbara has her job to do. I happen to respect her and like her very much because she does her job well. And we have our job to do. I think there ought to be critics. Do critics go too far? It doesn't matter. As long as we who have to make the final judgments can put all of it in balance.
So you consider critics like Barbara quite different from critics like Howie Carr or Jerry Williams? Different categories?
Oh, Barbara is a very nice person. Barbara would not insult an individual for the way they look or the way they walk or the way they talk or the fact that they're in a wheelchair or need braces. That's not her thing. She criticizes based on issues. That's all right. There's no problem there. I'm talking about the personal, mean-spirited type of thing that Howie Carr does when he calls one leader of a legislative body a midget, when he a corrupt midget, when he calls me a fat individual and fat city, when he talks, when he calls the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Massachusetts and his sister, a distinguished jurist in the Superior Court, a combination of their salaries as hack family of the week. Can you imagine anything more outrageous? The most respected two individuals, brother and sister, who have devoted their life to public service as hacks. That's what I'm talking about.
Is the environment, do you think, in our final minute, going to get any better in the coming years? Or do you think that this kind of rancor continues for the foreseeable future?
I think it'll get better. What has created it has been the length of time that this controversy has existed. Had we resolved this at the time when I first proposed it, things would have gotten better. But the constant, daily competition between talk show hosts trying to outdo each other as to their outrageous statements, the calls that they generate, the letters that they ask people to write, the mean-spiritedness that is spread amongst the public over a long period of time is what has created the situation. Once it's put to rest, once this economy turns around, once we take care of our credit rating and it improves, once we start to see Massachusetts becoming the state that it can become again, because it really hasn't changed. It's still one of the best places in this nation to live.
So you're an optimist about it?
I am an optimist about it.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for coming in. We
Thank you,
appreciate
Charlie.
it. We're going to take a break and come right back with Molly Yardiv now. Stay with us. 45, and there is your It is sometimes difficult to believe that they are talking about the same issue. So radically do my next two guests differ on the subject of taxes. You have heard what Speaker Kevarian had to say about the tax increase that passed the House the other day. Now we'll hear from the leaders of the pro and anti-tax groups. Barbara Anderson was the driving force behind Proposition 2.5 10 years ago. She heads the group Citizens for Limited Taxation. Jim Braude is the head of the pro-tax group, TEAM, Tax Equity Alliance of Massachusetts. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Charlie.
Barbara, lately we have seen a apparent turn in the tax tide. People like John Gould, head of the Associated Industries of Massachusetts, and some other business leaders coming together with a variety of different people in the legislature and a majority in the House now finally saying, look, for the health of our economy, for the health of our state, we've got to have some new revenues.
Well, that wasn't a turn, Charlie. I mean, gold was for the tax package last year. I mean,
but we now have a majority in the House. That
was the change. Yes, that was the turn.
Why now, and why not 5 months ago?
Well, I thought the miracle of it was that they didn't do it 5 months ago, that they actually held out, that they had the courage to say no, trying to get more cut packages coming out. The too bad part of it is that they gave in, that they caved. I think the reason they caved in is as simple as the fact that if they didn't, Richie Vogt was going to make them actually work, and some of those legislators have never read a budget, wouldn't have any idea.
Are you not at all persuaded by the arguments that the Speaker put forth a few minutes ago?
Which ones of the arguments? About the need for it? His arguments are accurate. They're right about the Medicaid. It's out of control. You use their arguments and point out that if they're correct, and they are, and Medicaid's going to be a major part of our budget increases every year, and we have to deal with something that's new now. They can't have business as usual any longer. We cannot possibly have a $1 billion tax increase every year and expect our economy to be sustained to the point where we can continue to provide services, never mind increases in things like Medicaid. So because of what the Speaker's saying, we cannot have a tax package. We have to use this opportunity to begin to downsize government so we can continue the Commonwealth into the 90s.
Jim, there was a lot of opposition to the tax package just 4 or 5 months ago. Why did it pass the other day?
I think because the legislators realized the only thing that their constituents like less than new taxes are declining services. I think the one thing that Barbara did agree with, the Speaker said, is how wonderful she was. Was he talking about her, by the way, or somebody else?
Sweetheart.
The reality is people demanded restructuring. They demanded downsizing. They got a lot of that in the budget. The legislative leadership stood up and said, we've got to be honest with the people. There have been some flaws along the way, but let's stand up and tell the truth. That means we need to raise money. Let's try to do it as fairly as possible. They should be proud of that. The problem is that Barbara is trying to make this whole thing a referendum on Mike Dukakis, legislators that people don't like. The incredible thing is after a year of this debate, all we hear are nickel and dime solutions to what is a multi-billion-dollar problem. As the Speaker said before, if you don't want taxes, then you got to stand up proudly and honestly and give us a list. You remember Richard Nixon had a secret plan to get us out of Vietnam? Remember why it was a secret?
Indeed, yeah.
There was no plan. That's Barbara's role model in this.
Hey, are we out of Vietnam or aren't we?
Let's provide no specifics.
Are we out of Vietnam or aren't we?
But we're not out of debt, Barbara. If it turns out all we have is government by anecdote. We had a plan, too.
Unfortunately, we didn't keep our plan secret. Our plan, at least to deal with this year's deficit, was our mini-bond program. We know that if we come in with suggestions or reject them just because it's us, so we've got nowhere with our plans at all. They won't listen.
Here's what I wonder. I wonder whether what's happened in the past week signals a dramatic shift in the political environment in the state. We know how truly brutal it's been in the past year or two.
Please, if there was a shift, it shifted back in a big hurry. We couldn't call out on the phones in our office for 2 days. We picked up 400 new petitioners in just 2 days in our office from people just calling in on 2 lines. Yesterday at the rally where 5,000 people were on Boston Common, Chip signed up another 900 and some petitioners, and another 1,000 people took petition drive cards. If there was a momentary lull, and I think the lull was partly my fault for saying they're not going to do it. These legislators are going to hang in there. They're going to demand more downsizing. So people said, okay, we'll give them a chance. When they found out they weren't even going to try, they were going to pass the tax package, $1.3 billion, before they even went in and began to work on the budget, that outrage turned around, and I have never seen people so angry.
They've been working on the budget for a year. As the Speaker said, they cut $1.2 billion. Every time I've ever asked you to tell us what we should cut, you give me the Lieutenant Governor's office for $400,000.
Which hasn't been cut.
The Legislative Research Bureau, that's gone. We won't hear about that again.
Legislative Service Bureau
Why don't you take the rest of my time for the next 5 minutes and tell us what you would do to get us out of this in a painless, tax-free way.
Fine.
The reason you won't do it is
because
you don't have a solution. Go right ahead.
He says I won't do it. Can I do it?
You can.
Our first plan is you have to deal with this year's deficit, which is about $800 million. Our plan was to float mini bonds, like tax-exempt bonds, for that amount of money or as much as people will buy. And people are buying up our bonds like crazy,
What do you
Charlie.
use to pay them off, Barbara?
You can wait for
Monopoly
3
money?
or 5 years because you do it like you do U.S. savings bonds. So you won't have to pay even interest on it for 3 or 5 years. They wouldn't even try it. They wouldn't even think about doing it. Then the other suggestions we've seen that have been given out by Chester Atkins
not suggestions you've seen. What would you suggest? Barbara, how can you credibly tell the people in this state they can avoid taxes if you don't have any other solution? All you talk about is what somebody else said. What do you say? What would you do?
I want to hear your
solution is
raising taxes every year. You give
after
your
$1 billion
solution
in
to
cuts.
Ms. McGillicuddy, who's trying to figure out where she's going to get another $357 this year in order to pay for a tax increase when you have not shown anyone where they can cut the budget in order to come up money for your members.
Ms. McGillicuddy, is instead of you and people like you pretending that there is a tax-free cure, Why don't you work with us to try to craft something that's fair to the Mrs. McGillicuddies?
We did.
of
We started out with
Massachusetts?
our mini bond program. They won't even listen
Aren't
to
there
us.
a
We
lot of Mrs.
suggested-
McGillicuddies who rely on Medicaid and things like that for their aunt or their
And
mother
what
or
they
something
have
like
to
that?
understand, Charlie, people have to understand that if they don't get this budget under control, and you have $500 or $600 million a year in new Medicaid money, half of which is only reimbursable, and if you have the budget busters going up every year, if they think they can still afford to fund a lieutenant governor's office that does nothing...
get rid of it,
but runs
Barbara.
the-
That's
They won't get
$400,000.
rid of it. Fine,
Where's
let's
the
get
other
rid of
billion?
it. Then you can have the second suggestion. Let's do each of the suggestions we've made. The High-Tech Council put in $1.6 billion. They're still waiting for the analysis of their suggestions.
Did you hear the specifics? I haven't quite yet heard them, except the Lieutenant Governor. We'll hear him after the show. You and I will
Yes,
talk
okay,
about
okay,
him outside.
okay. Let me just give me the time then. Be quiet for the time you were going to give me.
Go right
The
ahead.
Pioneer Institute. The Pioneer Institute just put out an analysis of the ET program. That was supposed to be the best of all the programs. As it turns out, it was a total waste of money, $250 million of the taxpayers' money, and it didn't reduce the welfare caseload at all.
Yeah, but
So what
you
are you
wouldn't
gonna say?
object to at least trying something like that. I mean, my God, people are talking constantly about welfare as a problem in the state. They at
was
least made a
tried.
good faith effort.
No, the federal government made a good faith effort with the program that cut down the eligibility. So that's when you saw the welfare rolls drop during the King years because of the federal OFA program. Then, of course, they came in and offered increased benefits to people to be on welfare so they could get off welfare. And at that point, you saw the welfare caseload steady, even though normally you lose $4,000 a year just naturally.
The reality appears to be, correct me if I'm wrong, that as the Speaker said, there is going to be some tax increase that is going to be
That's right.
enacted
And
into
we're
law
going to
in
repeal
the
it.
state. Okay. Well, let's get to the repeal in a second. Given that, what would you like to see it be? Would you like to see it be some combination of the gasoline, the income tax, the sales tax, or what? Do you think the Senate will add the sales tax to the mix?
I'm looking forward to the Senate explanation as to how they're going to do everybody a favor because they're going to cut back on the income tax increase and have a sales tax increase instead. I want to see if they really think people out here are stupid enough to believe that if they take the money from us at the cash register instead of from our paychecks, that everybody's going to be happy and will love them even despite what they have just done to us.
One of the rules of the show, Charlie, you have to answer an occasional question. The question was,
No,
what would you cut?
we
Not going to tell you.
we used to have that
I'm
rule.
not
But
going to
no
choose
more?
a tax
Throwing that
increase.
out. No.
I-
We've had too many
we are not
Boston City
choosing
councilors on,
taxes.
so we had to scrap that
understand.
rule.
I
The
got it.
sales tax is regressive. It was regressive until last week when Jim had to switch it because the income tax is going to make a mess of his
Let's
initiative
try to
petition.
give people-
Now
Talk
it's
about it?
progressive.
Yeah, let's try to give
it's
people,
a
Jim,
regressive tax.
some
We are
sense
solidly opposed to the sales tax.
of what is going to happen in
And
the
the
next couple of
income
months.
tax.
What taxes are going to go up? We
Well-
know about gasoline, almost certainly income to some extent.
To some extent, I think that's true. What we were talking about last week, we were trying to forge a coalition of labor, human services, business people to stand up and say, listen, we're going to have to compromise a bit to rescue the decent things that government does. It was one of these weird times when good politics and good policy were about to intersect. One of the areas where that was about to happen was about expanding the current sales tax to a whole host of business services. Responsible business leaders ready to stand up and say, we've got to pay more ourselves to rescue decent things in this state. Barbara was against that because I think she realizes that that kind of coalition is exactly what we need to make sure that November 6th is Barbara's retirement party, not a celebration of cutting $2 or $3 billion more out of government.
Big business leaders want to tax small business up in the Merrimack Valley so that their big businesses are protected in Boston and so their bonds are protected so they can loan money to the state and bail out their banks that are in trouble
You know
because
what's
of their condos.
incredible is that every one of these shows, not only does Barbara not answer any questions, but more incredibly, I've never heard you say one good thing about anything that government
Tell us
does.
where my members are going to cut. Here's a question for you, Jim.
I wanna hear
Where are
them.
my members going to cut in order to fill in for your members to get their
That's
pay
right.
raises?
So you should support a fair tax package that makes sure that it's
Oh,
not
right.
just they that
$1.3
pay,
billion
but that
of
everybody
fair taxes.
contributes.
In our
Yeah,
fin-
name the $1.3 billion in fair taxes,
I'd be
Jim.
glad to.
In our final
But
couple
unfortunately, we're out of time. Jim can't get around to that
in
part.
our final couple of minutes,
Yes.
what is the likelihood that these taxes that are passed in the next few weeks or a month are going to be repealed rolled back next fall when Barbara's petition is on the ballot?
Why don't you ask her first, and then
No,
I'll
I
tell you how
wanna
she's
start with
wrong.
you.
I think a critical question is not just what can get through the legislature, but as you suggest, what can survive. I am thoroughly convinced that if one, people believe we have done the kind of restructuring that's going on, two, they believe it's part of a long-term cure, and three, most importantly, they believe that everybody contributes fairly to the rescue of decent things that government does. They're not going to be gleeful on November 6th, but they're going to say, listen, we got to do this to put this behind us, get it off the 6 o'clock news. I'm very hopeful if people like you and me can force Barbara to answer some questions over the next 5.5 months, that sanity and compassion can prevail.
I think it's very interesting in this morning's paper, Barbara, that Jim Manzi comes out against the petition.
Who?
Is that Jim Manzi,
Who's Jim Manzi?
one of the leading high-tech executives in our state?
I don't think he's a leading high-tech executive in the state. The high-tech people who've been with us
Well,
forever
I mean, he
are
is.
tall
He's,
enough.
you know, he's the president of Lotus, and it's a very big,
See, well,
important
that's
company.
because,
employs a lot of people.
See, Dick Manley met with John Sasso in the bar of the Union Club last week in order to plan how they were going to get people who supported 2.5
Were they drinking
to come
then?
out. Yeah, well, they were meeting in order to plot the demise of Barbara Anderson, and unfortunately, they were plotting it loudly so people heard them say it. So the idea was, of course, to get people who supported 2.5 to say we've gone too far this year. But this year, you see, if we don't do what we're doing, and maybe Jim Manzi doesn't understand this, if we don't do it, there's this slow economic slowdown in Massachusetts. It's going to turn into an economic decline because every single year they're going to need more taxes. And this year, if Jim can find $1.3 billion in fair taxes, by next year they're going to need another $500 million in fair taxes and another $500 million in fair taxes. And who provides the services for the people in this state when the productive citizens finally have had enough?
Happy Mother's Day, Barbara.
Thank you, Jim.
Barbara, Happy
Same to
Mother's
you.
Day. Thank you for coming in.
Yes.
Thanks for coming in, Jim.
My pleasure.
Not Happy Mother's Day to you.
Thank you.
We're going to take a break. We're going to come right back and talk about the high cost of getting old. Stay with us.